Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, which are grown-up conversations for grown-up people about history, religion, culture, and why they matter. This comes to you, of course, from Mount Olympus, where we look down on the doings of mere mortals and pass Olympian judgments on all that's happening. But, it is kind of a foggy day.
Is it some sort of a holiday? Because you're not wearing a tie or a waistcoat or any of your usual splendor.
No, well, and there's no books either. And I'm not in my house. I'm staying at a friend's place in Skopje in North Macedonia. So needs must. But this is, yes, so we can count it as a holiday, I guess. Thank you for that.
Yes,
Right.
something like that.
Now, who are you?
Yeah, right. My name is Coel Campo, and today's is our sixth episode in our series on Eastern catastrophes, and we're calling this one From Cold War to Hot War, and hopefully you can give us a good explanation for what that's supposed to mean.
Right, well, this is the penultimate episode in this series. Next week, we're going to be interviewing my friend Taras Jubanski from the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and he's going to explain to us what role that plays in society there. But the meaning of this week's title is basically taking the story from the end of World War II as we launch into the Cold War, which lasts basically 45 years, and bringing things up to date to the current war in Ukraine, which we're going to say very little about because, if the internet ever collapses someday now, it'll be under the sheer weight of commentary about the Ukraine war. And although I have plenty to say about it, it's not anything that other people haven't said elsewhere. So we'll just take it up to there and kind of like leave things plop right at that point.
I guess those of us who know you better, unfortunately, are not safe from your opinions on such things, but...
This is true, yeah, but it did seem a shame to inflict it on the public. Well, I don't know, don't tempt me, it could happen. But not here, it's not today.
Today we are talking about Poland and Ukraine.
Yes, we certainly are, and dividing the time between the two of them. But we'll just start off by taking a kind of overview. I think we looked at this map last week, which basically shows the territorial results of the end of World War II. So all of Ukraine is included in the Soviet Union. And the new communist satellite Poland of the Cold War years had been pushed 100 miles further west by the results of the war, losing Western Ukraine and Western Belarus and being given large parts of Germany to make up for it. Now this is a bitter experience for all Ukrainians, but especially for those in the West. They hadn't much liked living under Poland between the wars, and they were going to like living under the Soviet Union a whole lot less.
So in a less than great way, World War II sort of ends up uniting all the Ukrainian lands, but in the USSR...
Right. The lands had not really been united before. Well, I'm trying to think now. Are there exceptions? Maybe under the Mongols or something for a while, but they hadn't really been united, but now they were, but not really in a way that Ukrainians would have wanted. They're part of the Soviet Union. Yeah. Not that Poles were necessarily very much happier either, and we need to take full account of the Polish sense of betrayal by the Western Allies, principally the British and Americans at the end of the war. Because to reward Stalin for the Soviet Union's enormous contribution to the war effort, Churchill and Roosevelt effectively gave away half of pre-war Poland to the Soviet Union at Yalta. The Yalta conference was the meeting of the big three where they pretty much divided Europe up along the boundaries that were to emerge at the end of World War II. And what remained of Poland was the only Allied country to be abandoned by the West to communism after 1945. Right? The other countries that came under communist rule had never really been allies, but Poland was looked on in a very different light, and yet there it was, subjected to communism. To be entirely fair to the British and Americans, there probably wasn't a whole lot they could have done about it without actually starting another world war, taking on the Soviet Union right away. And nobody was really up for that.
Yeah, my question to you, do you feel like this was it really necessary for them to make that decision?
Well, all answers condemn. It's unimaginable to think how the British and Americans could have done much else short of a new war with Stalin. It was probably unavoidable, but if you were Polish, boy, would you be feeling sick about that. And the Soviet account of the massacre of Polish officers at Katyn, those are the Polish officers captured by the Soviets in September 1939 and murdered in the spring of 1940 by Stalin, by the NKVD. The Soviet account was that the Germans were the culprits, which was nonsense. But it was accepted by the British and Americans during the war because they couldn't afford to alienate a key ally. But it was tacitly accepted after it as well. And again, if you're Polish, you must just feel despair, really, I suppose.
Yeah, like the Soviet Ukrainians during the famine of the 1930s, the outside world it kind of just had to collectively turn their head away and leave them to their fate.
That's effectively what happened. Yes. Yes. Now, we can't go much further with this without me recommending a second book by Anne Applebaum. We already recommended a few weeks ago her excellent book, Red Famine, about the Holodomor, the famine in the 1930s in Ukraine. This is one from 2013, Iron Curtain. It's not actually about all of the countries that fell under the Iron Curtain at the start of the Cold War. She focuses upon just four. The enforcement of communism on the peoples of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. Now, of course, in 1945, East Germany isn't even a country. It's merely the Soviet occupation zone, just as the Americans and the British and the French have occupation zones of Germany. But that soon was cut off from the other three and became a Soviet satellite state. So she looks at the process of enforcing communism upon those societies, their political structures, civil society, well, the obliteration really of civil society and all that. And it really is an excellent study.
And if you were at home, would you be waving this book at us as well, or
yes,
is this not part?
Yes, I would.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Consider yourself waved.
Yes, okay. Consider yourself waved, people. Okay, let's dive into what's happening in Poland specifically under communism. And as in all of the new satellite states, the local communist leader, Soviet appointee Birut, is placed alongside Stalin. This is the kind of stuff you get in public demonstrations, public propaganda in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, so on. Here is a map I think we've looked at before, but it's just reminding us of Poland's territorial losses and gains in 1945. So the yellow line shows Poland before World War II, so between the world wars. The light brown area is the bit that was grabbed by the Soviets in September 1939 while the Nazis were grabbing the rest. And the Soviets got that back at the end of the war. And Poland was, I'm trying to find another word than compensated. But at any rate, it was given territory from Germany, from which Germans were driven out. So, as you can see there, half of East Prussia, the other half became a Russian exclave, which is today centered on Kaliningrad, the former German city of Königsberg, which was absolutely trashed in January and February 45, and large swathes of Silesia and so on in the west, so the other eastern areas of Germany. So millions of Germans driven out and populated really by Poles who've been driven out of what had been Eastern Poland and is now Soviet Union. Now, it's worth just considering the version of World War II which Poles were required to believe or affect to believe during the Cold War period. So the achievements of emigre Poles who fought in the West, especially those who'd got out and fought as part of the British Army under General Anders, they were dismissed as minimal in terms of the war effort and irrelevant. The Armia Krajowa, the home army, which had kept fighting the Germans on home soil and had organised the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, as we saw last week, that was vilified, its members were arrested, and astonishingly, they were denounced as fascists. Now, this is a standard tactic of communists in almost all countries, including Western countries, after the war, that anybody who they didn't like, which was basically everybody, they tried to smear with the label fascism, a tendency which has not entirely gone away in the present.
Yes.
The communist Armia Ludowa, the People's Army, which is a much smaller Polish resistance group, was the only one publicly acknowledged. So the public discourse was that all of the resistance to the Nazis by Poles was really the People's Army, the little communist group. The Katyn massacre was forbidden to be mentioned unless you were endorsing the falsehood that it was a Nazi crime. And the Holocaust of the Jews was not discussed as a unique catastrophe, but only as part of general Polish losses during the war. And the same kind of thing was true within the Soviet Union as well. Is this because communists didn't like to make distinctions between people groups, especially those defined by religion? Or is it because anti-Semitism was so deep in Russia, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and so on, that the regime decided it was better to just talk about it as Nazi crimes against people generally? Probably a little of each. And also the deportations by the Soviets during 1939 to 41, these were not discussed.
Did Poles, the kids in school, did they actually believe any of this
junk?
Yeah. Garbage.
I guess, I don't really know, but my guess would be no, because the parents of almost all of them, unless the parents were committed party members or something like that, would have not only been able to, but wanting to tell their kids at home, look, don't believe this is nonsense. Let's just take a step back here and look at communist Europe as a whole during the Cold War. People were fed fallacious nonsense about World War II, or half-truths at best. And what that meant was that the reality was never discussed, as, for example, it was not only in America and Western Europe, but of course, most importantly in West Germany, where it was confronted. And that meant that people had time to come to terms with it. But when the Cold War ended, when communism ended, this hadn't really happened in formerly communist Europe. And so all of these issues bubbled back to the surface. When there was fighting when Yugoslavia broke up, all of the factions talked as though they were refighting World War II because the issues hadn't been resolved. They'd all been buried under a load of communist garbage that nobody actually believed.
So it's the Soviets and the communists who are pushing this kind of narrative.
Of course, yeah. They have a monopoly on public discourse, as they did in all of the communist countries. It's part of what we mean by a totalitarian system. quick digression. Totalitarian is one of these words that's waved around these days far, far too loosely, either to smear someone you don't like, or even if it's used more tightly than that, to refer to any system that's not democratic. That's nonsense, right? Totalitarianism basically refers almost exclusively to fascist and communist societies, where, well, it's coined in early 1920s Italy by an opponent of Mussolini, but when Mussolini saw the description, totalitarismo, he agreed with it, right? Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Yeah, that's a pretty good definition of totalitarianism. So no real civil society, and so no real possibility of criticism.
Right.
Okay, here is a piece of communist Polish propaganda, Nad Odre, to the River Oder. So heading west and encouraging settlement westwards. It's portrayed as patriotic, taking revenge on Germany. But of course, all it's really doing is offsetting the lands taken in the east by the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so what's actually a defeat, namely losing all the lands in the east, is being presented as a triumph because of the lands that's gained from Germany in the west.
Yes. And what the public have to do is to look at what's not being said. Right. Now, this is something that people living under totalitarian systems became very good at, seeing what was going on by noticing what was not said and drawing their own conclusions. Right. This is something Solzhenitsyn was to remark on much later on, that people in his own country, in the Soviet Union, were better at ferreting out the truth by this kind of method than Westerners who had all kinds of information available to them and didn't truly absorb it or came up with mad theories about it.
Yeah.
Well, now we can't go much further without looking at an extremely unpleasant and embarrassing reality. And this is the fate of at least some Jews who had survived the Holocaust and returned to their homes in Poland and faced new crimes. Now, this is a passage I've lifted from the University of Michigan PhD written just a few years ago, 16 years ago, about Jews, Poles, and Slovaks. And she describes the kind of processes that happened in 1945 and 1946. In villages and small towns where everybody knew almost everything about everybody, the return after liberation inevitably turned into constant renegotiations of the terms of communal coexistence. People knew how their neighbours had behaved during the war, who had collaborated with the Germans, who had gone into the forest to fight the Germans, and who had helped or denounced Jews. After the war, villagers judged one another according to their communal hierarchy of values. For them, only collaboration with the Nazis was unacceptable and thus openly condemned. All other types of behaviour, although often thought of as repulsive, remained within the limits of acceptability. Action or inaction towards their Jewish neighbours belonged to that category. Villagers were willing to justify anti-Jewish wrongdoing in their community as part of the inescapable costs of the war. After all, the Jews were doomed in this war, and nothing could have been done to reverse their fate, especially when the death penalty and rules of collective responsibility were applied, by the Nazis, of course, to those who dared to help Jews. Despite this self-proclaimed absolution, inescapable guilt on the one hand and material gain from Jewish property on the other left villagers with a sense of unease in the presence of returning survivors. Because, of course, what had happened is that when Jews were grabbed, taken away to prison, concentration camps, relocated, whatever, their neighbours told themselves, most often correctly, well, they're dead then. They're not going to be needing their house or their farm or their animals or their furniture or their property anymore, and people help themselves. And mostly that calculation was correct. But what if that person was amongst the few who survived and then returned? And this was one of the things that caused trouble. This unease made peasants and townsmen ask the most painful, well-documented question in countless Jewish testimonies. Are you alive? We thought the Germans killed all of you. How much easier the return to normalcy would have been for an entire village if none of their Jewish residents had returned and nobody had asked difficult questions. The absence of the Jewish returnees would have spared their neighbours questions about what happened to a Jewish family member who'd been hiding in the area and had not been killed by the Nazis. What happened to one's house, farm, furniture, or money entrusted to a non-Jewish neighbour, and dozens of other concerns. But a handful of Jewish survivors returned, and an entire community had to cope with the consequences of their past actions. And of course, what happens in the couple of years after the end of the war is rather a lot of anti-Jewish violence in Poland. And this is something that still has the power to shock even today. After all that had happened in World War II, even those who survived found that they faced new violence and a number of them were killed. Well, why is this? Firstly, the anti-Semitism was incredibly deep-rooted. There were, as we just saw there, local concerns that returnees would reclaim their property, which was pretty awkward if you, in the meantime, built your life around having it.
Right.
There was loads of post-war banditry. Poland, in the aftermath of World War II, was a very lawless place for a couple of years because literally millions of people are being propelled from Kresy, the east, over the middle to the new west into homes that had been occupied by Germans. Warsaw was mostly in ruins. Loads of people were homeless or displaced. There was immense resentment of the incoming Soviets and also huge resentment against Polish communists who were being installed in power. And Jews were seen as identified with the Soviet occupiers and the new puppet communist regime in Poland. A lot of functionaries of the regime were killed in this struggle. People like Armia Krajowa, Home Army soldiers who were in danger of being imprisoned. They're on the loose and they might well attack communist functionaries, and Jews are overrepresented amongst those functionaries. So the general violence in the country during this period claimed tens of thousands of lives, including 1,000 to 2,000 Jews.
This just never ceases to amaze me, the subject of anti-Semitism and over the years and how it looks. And so for anybody else who is also feeling that way, if you want to understand just how deeply rooted this was in this part of Europe, you can go back and see the second and third episode of our first series about Israel and the Jews.
Yes, please do that. If you haven't seen it already, this will explain, how this poison takes root and how it becomes particularly potent actually in modern times.
Right.
Okay, well, here's a picture of mourners at a funeral of the Kielce pogrom victims, 42 Jews killed in this town in July 1946. This next picture shows Warsaw in the later stages of the war there in 1944 to 45. And here we have post-war exhumations in Warsaw. There were about 200,000 bodies in the city. And of course, they're going to smell, but it's also extremely distressing. They can't be just left there. This is just as the war is coming to an end, that there was still fighting going on in Easter 1945, but to the west, around Berlin. There's a girl in the ruins of the Church of the Sacraments in the New Town Square, and under the rubble of that square, there were about 1,000 civilians killed, including over 30 nuns. And here's people living in an apartment that's basically open to the, well, not quite to the sky, but it is kind of to the outside. Although this kind of scene will be repeated in many parts of Europe, particularly Germany. The floor was there and the ceiling was there, but loads of the walls weren't. And here they are having a meal. And that situation continued for a while after the war. This is a Warsaw bookshop right near the end of the war. Now, Itzikowski had been the biggest chain of bookstores in the Russian Empire before the Russian Revolution in 1917. Remember, the largest part of Poland had been part of the Russian Empire. But the company survived in interwar Poland until the Nazi destruction in 1944. But here's a remaining branch, and they're selling sheet music amongst the rubble.
Yeah, the continuity through all the vast changes in just 30 years is amazing.
It is amazing. And that story is not unique to Poland. We could look at pictures, similar kind of pictures of a boy sitting on a pile of rubble reading books in the London Blitz. You know, the bookshop has been bombed, and he's picking up books and reading them. And similar kind of scenes in Germany where there had been similar vast destruction to Warsaw. Well, here we've got a little girl about a year after the fighting stopped in Muranov, looking out at central Warsaw. And this is the same girl, I think, in the same place. Just another shot. And young man here in 1947.
This is something that we often forget about. Just because a war is over doesn't mean everything can possibly go back to normal. I mean, quite apart from all the dead people, there are countless people who are just scarred for the rest of their lives.
Yes. And we need to think about that rest of their lives. You know, here is a picture of a little boy just after the war, and that evokes our pity. And we think, oh, a cute kid. Oh, gosh, he's lost a leg. This is sad. But 60 years later, he'll be a disabled old man who will evoke a lot less pity, and everyone will have forgotten why he's only got one leg. So, you know, this is, the pain just goes on and on and on. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, here's a girl in a TB sanatorium for Jewish children in Otvodsk. Here we've got some schoolboys in Garvolin. And notice there, in 1948, some of them still not got shoes. And some secondary school pupils walking through still ruined Warsaw in 1948. Here's Warsaw 1949. Here's a railway map of Poland in 1953, and the continuities with history are really striking. You've just got to look at that map, and it's quite clear which areas used to be German and which were formerly part of the Russian Empire. Right? The legacy of these things lives on. And this is true in so many aspects of life. You know, communism has been gone from Central and Eastern Europe now for what? Not quite 35 years, but well over 30. And still, very large proportions of the population are living in communist era apartment blocks. You know, the legacy just of these kinds of things just goes on and on. Okay, let's lighten things up here with a little communist era joke from Poland. So you can tell these jokes at risk of going to jail for years, literally. I'm not making this up. I know someone who spent 5 years in prison in Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia, for doing precisely this and spending the rest of his life, even though he was a university graduate in the 1950s when that was rare, having just factory hand jobs because of all this. Okay, so you took a risk, but people tell jokes anyway. Polish communist official is talking to a farmer. I've heard that you go to church every day. Yes, that's right, says the farmer. I've been doing it since my childhood. I've been told, the official continues, that each time you kneel at the foot of the cross and kiss the feet of Jesus. That's right, it's a Catholic ritual, says the farmer. But you're a member of the party. Will you also kiss the feet of the leader of our party? Here we go. Yes, as long as he was nailed to a crucifix. How to live dangerously.
I feel I shouldn't laugh at that.
No, you shouldn't really, no. But
yes.
What can you do? Okay, so large parts of Poland are a massive building site eventually once the government gets itself into gear, once the violence dies down a bit. And here, rebuilding in, I think this is in Warsaw actually, in the 1950s. And you can see in the next picture here, there's still ruins, but the area has been cleared. The start has been made on redeveloping this area, or these preparations for it. And here we have a market and shop area that looks pretty recent, and trolley buses and newly rebuilt homes. Rather nicely rebuilt, you've got to say, actually.
And this is only 10 years after the war. I mean, the government is making a pretty decent job of this, at least.
Yes, it sticks in my throat every time I need to say anything nice at all about anything communist, but to be entirely fair, in Poland at least, not really anywhere else, they did make a pretty good job of rebuilding, especially Warsaw, but also other cities, and consciously used old plans and old photographs so that what was rebuilt looked exactly like what had been destroyed. Obviously not everywhere. They built loads of horrible concrete tower blocks and apartment blocks that are still with us. And as we shall see in a moment, something else rather special. Stalin's wedding cake, dominating the rubble in 1954. And the next picture shows it from another angle. It was the Warsaw Palace of Culture. Only communist regimes could have palaces of culture. And it's designedly similar to a number of buildings in Moscow that are still to this day referred to as Stalin's wedding cakes, like Moscow University.
Yeah, so the communists were trying to make Poland look like Russia.
Yes. Maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously. We've got to remember that the senior Polish communist officials will have spent a lot of their lives in the Soviet Union, right? Local communist parties, not just in Poland but elsewhere, were often eliminated or subject to purges right after the end of the war. Stalin was obsessed that only his communists would take over in the various countries, right? So these people, a lot of them will have spent time in the Soviet Union and be trying to copy it. And there's also quite a big effort through the education system and so on to make people naturally look eastwards in their communal and public life. So yeah, that's part of what's going on here. There's some more of Warsaw in the 50s and family outing. Again, pretty nicely set out, the city here, by the mid-1950s. Now let's come to this man, Stefan Wyszynski. He is a great hero in Poland today. He had been fortunate to survive Nazi massacres during the war, and he was wanted by the Gestapo, so he was in hiding a lot of the time. He also hid some Jews, although it has to be admitted, and this is really painful, that even though he tried very hard to save Jews from the clutches of the Nazis, he himself harboured a whole range of pretty awful anti-Jewish prejudices, because this was so widespread. Even he thought a load of this stuff. Well, he was made Archbishop of Warsaw in 1948, but 5 years later he's arrested for participating in protests against the arrest of another bishop, and he was locked up in a monastery for 3 years. And by that time there were 2,000 priests in prison in Poland.
Yeah, and remind us, why are the communists so opposed to the church?
Well, the opposition is, the antagonism is mutual. Marxism is a materialist creed. It says that matter is all that exists. Religion and even ethics, in a way, are an illusion. Well, the only ethics that are real are simply stuff that serve materialist ends, and they can be changed when it suits us and so on. And the church was associated with previous regimes, but also it's an alternative focus of loyalty to the party. Right? They're looking to Rome, and it's also making them Western orientated, whereas the practicalities of life in the communist bloc during the Cold War is to try and make people look east. So all of these things come together. But in Poland, the communists really had a hard time because the vast bulk of the population was so attached to the church.
Yeah.
Well, This man, he's largely forgotten about now, certainly outside Poland, Wierut. He's a hardline Stalinist leader. He died in March 1956. The rumour is that he died of a heart attack after hearing about the contents of Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin. That may or may not be true. But anyway, the fact is he dies in March 1956, and that sparks a debate amongst Polish communists themselves about whether Poland should liberalise and how far that should go. Now, liberalise, not in a sense that would be acceptable to you or me or any of our listeners, but within a communist framework.
Right.
And that summer, a whole load of riots break out in Poznan in June. The homemade poster there simply says, "We want bread." The local Communist Party headquarters was ransacked. The secret police office was attacked. 100,000 people turned out on the streets to demonstrate, and several dozen people were killed, including actually 8 police officers. And we've got a couple of pictures here of some of these riots in June. Tanks come out onto the streets. And this spreads that October. In October of the same year, there are generalized protests across the country. Many of our listeners and viewers will know about the uprising in Hungary in the same month, actually, October 1956, which was for a while, for like 2 or 3 weeks, more successful because it actually captured power and extremely violent and was repressed equally violently. Well, the demands in Poland were at least somewhat more moderate. They weren't actually demanding the complete overturn of the communist system. But they wanted, for example, the reinstatement of the Polish white eagle in the flag. Soviets despised this and had made sure that it wasn't there. An end to the mistreatment of the church. The return of the Eastern Territories, Kresy, to Poland, which was completely unrealistic. An acknowledgement of the Katyn massacres as to what they were really all about. And an end to compulsory education of Russian language in schools. This is a point that always makes me smile. Virtually everybody in all of the communist countries, even in Yugoslavia, which broke away from the Soviet bloc in 1948, was required to learn Russian, and virtually everybody made a point of forgetting it as fast as they were taught it. Other languages, they didn't mind learning. Russian, they weren't, even if it was fairly similar to their own language. Well, with the cooperation of Khrushchev in Moscow, a former Polish communist leader of Władysław Gomułka came to power. Bierut had been dead for a number of months, as a move to appease the crowds. Why should this appease the crowds? No particular reason, except that Gomułka had previously been disgraced by the communists. So if you're mad at the communists, well, Gomułka could only be an improvement. And he promised liberalisation, which for a while he did institute. The mistreatment of the Catholic Church was reversed for a while, though in the 1960s he backtracked. How could he not? He was a communist. Here we have him addressing the crowds, trying to calm them all down. And here we have him standing between Khrushchev on the left and Bulganin, senior Soviet minister, on his right, on our right of him. Well, Gomułka met with the semi-imprisoned Cardinal Wyszynski. Wyszynski had years before had come to done a deal is probably too strong a term, but come to an agreement with the communists that he would back the socialist state, the collectivization of farms, and the dubiously legal annexation of Western lands for Germany. And in return, the government would allow religion to be taught in schools, unprecedented in a communist country, faculties of theology to exist, religious orders, monks and nuns, and chaplains in the army and hospitals, again unheard of in a communist country. But of course, by the mid-1950s, the state had broken every single one of these undertakings on its side of the deal, although it didn't actually abolish the religious orders, but it did take away all their property. So if you're a monk or a nun, what are you going to do? kind of difficult. Where are you going to live? Now, Gomulka could see that if the 1956 disturbances continued, and he only had to look south to what was going on in Hungary to see where this could lead, Soviet troops would be used against the people, and an even harsher dictator imposed on Poland by Moscow. So he released Wyszynski, and they clearly had this negotiation, I don't like you, you don't like me, but heck, we can't allow this situation to get any worse. So if I ease up on the church, you need to use your authority to ordinary people so that they calm down the rioting and we can get to some kind of normality, which is, what happened for a while.
And this is the guy that we just mentioned a few slides ago who becomes Archbishop.
Yeah, he already was Archbishop, and he'd been made a cardinal in 1953. For people who don't know what a cardinal is, basically, if you're an Archbishop and you become a cardinal, you continue as an Archbishop. It's just that the cardinal has only really one job, and that is that when the Pope dies, you are amongst those who are consulted as to who's going to be the next Pope. Right.
So a promotion for him.
A promotion, yes. Just as he was about to go into prison.
Right.
Well, here we've got a picture of Danzig, or Gdansk, as it is now, Polish Gdansk. At the top, we can see it in ruins. And by 1960, it's looking pretty good. And it's another one of these cities that's largely rebuilt, as closely as possible to the way that it had been when it had been German populated before the war. What we've got in this next picture here is people standing in line to buy normal household goods. And this is a situation that continued right until the end of communism.
Yeah, we talked about the reasons for this in an earlier episode. There are shortages because the prices never really match supply, because both are being decided upon by the central government.
Yes. In a what we laughingly call a free market system, basically customers and suppliers are in constant negotiation. They don't know that they are, but they are. Your willingness to buy a Snickers bar at price X, right, is reflected right across the entire population and tells the company the way to make the maximum profit is to supply this many at this price. You could sell more at a lower price, but you make less money. You could sell fewer at a higher price, but you'd make less money. Your profit is maximized by selling this many at this price. And sometimes if things change, the cost of production or people's ability to buy Snickers bars or willingness or whatever, this changes over time. And so most changes are pretty gradual, right? But where prices and output are both fixed by simply a diktat from government, this is what will be done, well, there's never going to be a match. And the result is constant shortage of all kinds of everyday objects. Well, here's Warsaw by the late 1960s. It had been rebuilt. Another picture of the same. And again, the same.
This really doesn't look too bad, apart from the very small number of cars. It doesn't look that radically different to some of Western Europe at this time.
Right, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It looks pretty good. And in certain respects, like the absence of advertising hoardings, it looks better. Although, of course, they do have hoardings, but they're ghastly political slogans. Right? But people's living conditions in private are much worse. So, like I said, there are shortages of everything. But if you look around, like the material structure of the towns and so on, they are mostly okay. They're kind of drab. I know this from personal experience, having visited a couple of communist countries in the 1970s, right? But certainly adequate. Okay, well, there are more protests in 1970 and again in 1976. In December 1970, there's a new rash of protests and strikes over massive hikes in food prices. And 44 people ended up being killed by soldiers, and Gomulka resigned. He's replaced by Edward Gierek. And the early 1970s see a pretty big increase in the standards of living in Poland. But by 1976, the wheels are coming off the economy again. There's renewed, sometimes violent protests over huge price increases for food. And again, both times in 1970 and 76, these price increases are simply decreed by government for the reasons I just explained. And on both occasions, the government was forced to back down over the price rises because the public reaction was so fierce. And you can imagine that demonstrations in communist countries are rare and dangerous to participate in. But in Poland, they happened anyway.
Yeah, it seems like Poland was much harder for communist governments to keep under control than the other Soviet bloc states.
Yes. I mean, several other Soviet bloc states did have their moments, like Czechoslovakia in 1968 and Hungary, the terrible violence in Hungary in 1956. But yeah, the repeated pressure from huge swathes of the public in Poland wasn't really matched anywhere else. And partly what's fueling that is people's Catholic loyalty. And that brings us, of course, to this man, one of the heroes of the 20th century, Karol Wojtyła. You and I and everybody else know him better as Pope John Paul II. Well, he had spent some of the war years attending a secret seminary during the Nazi occupation. And he was teaching church history, sound man, I say. Good subject. He was ordained in 1946, made Archbishop of Krakow in 1964, appointed a cardinal in 1967, and in 1978 he became Pope John Paul II, which caused a sensation around the world, and he was the first non-Italian pope since 1523. I mean, if he'd been German or French or something like that, it would have been a sensation. But a Pole from a communist country, absolute sensation. Well, the following year, 1979, once he's Pope, he's based in Rome. The following year, he goes back to Poland for a papal visit. The communist authorities had forbidden Pope Paul VI to visit Poland when he'd asked to do so some years before. They basically just said, no, go away, keep out. But this guy was a Pole, so that was harder to do. And his reception was absolutely rapturous. You get, as we can see here in this picture, 300,000 people gather in Victory Square, where the new Pope kisses the tomb of the unknown soldier. I have to admit, this stuff makes me a little queasy because we're wrapping religion up with national fervour, which is never a good plan, but it does happen. Certainly in Poland. And here's an open-air mass with the Pope in the same year.
Yeah, so did the government just allow this to happen? I mean, I guess 300,000 people, you can't put them all in jail.
You can't put them all in jail, yeah. They just felt that it was going to be impossible to keep control at all if you seriously tried to stop it. So however sick they felt about it, they had to let it happen. They didn't show it on television. They minimized publicity. But everybody knew what was happening, and hundreds of thousands of people just showed up anyway, despite official obstructionism. So they just had to roll with the punch there. But things got worse from the Polish Communist government point of view. Because what emerges in 1980 is this, Solidarność, solidarity. It is an independent trade union. Now, there were trade unions in communist countries, but like everything else in communist countries, all organizations were simply arms of the government. They weren't seriously there to negotiate with managers on behalf of workers. They were simply one more means of controlling the workforce. Right? But this is an independent trade union, and they're doing exactly that. And it starts in the Gdansk shipyards. This is the strike committee, and the two guys, I'm not quite sure who the one on the left is, but the one on the right is Lech Walesa, who's about to become globally famous as a result of this. And by September 1981, by the time the thing's about a year old, they've got 10 million members, which is a third of the working age population. This is an unstoppable force. So there's a shipyard strike in Gdansk, and the government's forced to actually negotiate with a trade union. Here he is, Valensa being carried on the shoulders of some of his colleagues. And another picture of him here. He's considered to be a hero, for one of their own. Here are solidarity leaders interrupting their trades union convention, which is being held in a sports centre, to celebrate mass in 1981.
This is really difficult to imagine Western trades union leaders being so conspicuously religious.
Yeah, can you imagine the Teamsters in America? Or the
Yeah.
TNT in Britain? Not exactly, right? But there, yes. But what's true in many of the communist countries, most I would say, and certainly above all in Poland, is that churches are the only organisations that aren't completely controlled by government, and therefore they're an outlet for the energies of ordinary people who may not necessarily be all that religious, to be able to say something, to express something that isn't simply parroting communist duck speak. Well, understandably, the Polish government got really worried about this, and that December they introduced martial law as an emergency measure. General Jaruzelski takes over at the helm of Poland to try and slow the drive to end communist power. They can't crush it; it's too big, but they can try and slow it down, which they spend the 1980s doing. We've got a nice picture here of Lech Walesa meeting his fellow Pole, Pope John Paul II. Well, in 1989, and you remember by this point, Gorbachev has been in power in the Soviet Union for 4 years. He's embarked on liberalisation of the Soviet Union. He's actually giving the green light to the satellite states outside the Soviet Union to do the same. And the Polish government agrees to allow legislative elections. Now, are those legislative elections free and fair? In one sense, they're rigged because they guarantee the communists a large slice of the members of the Sejm, the parliament, right? But they're mostly free and fair for all the other seats. And of course, Solidarity win almost all of them, and they have a majority. And what happens in pretty short order is that once they've got that majority and they're the government, they reorganise the constitutional furniture to turn Poland into a full-on democracy. And Walesa becomes president of that full-on democracy in December 1990.
Yeah, so this guy goes from trades union leader to president.
Right. Rebel trade union leader, in danger of being locked up or worse by the communists, to actually seeing the communists off and being freely elected as president. And to prove his democratic bona fides, then standing down, when his term is done. Yeah. And he's still alive today. You can see, he's 81 this year. He's still with us. Brits and Americans and some others like to think, well, the Cold War was ended basically by Reagan and Thatcher being tough and Gorbachev being brave and trying to reform the Soviet Union and the thing collapsing. But a lot of people, particularly in Poland, would point to two poles. I mean, the influence of the Pope was outsized. And what Walesa did inside Poland kind of like blazed a trail, which eventually would be followed by others in other satellite states.
Yeah, and it just so happened that the conditions in the rest of the world sort of helped that to happen.
Yes. I mean, let's not buy into too much self-loathing here. I think if there had been no Gorbachev, if there had been no Reagan, no Thatcher, things would have looked very different. Yes, but right. The whole thing came together. Okay, now we need to look at what's going on in Ukraine. It's now united, but in the Soviet Union. Western Ukraine, that had been part of Poland between the wars, is now in the Soviet Union. And we just want to take the story up to the present. Well, as we mentioned last time, resistance to Soviet rule continued for years after 1945 in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, in Belarus, and in particularly Western Ukraine. People disappeared into the forests as guerrilla fighters. They're called, the Forest Brothers, Forest Brethren. This is a group of anti-Soviet fighters, actually not in Ukraine, but in Lithuania in May 49. But here are some of the Ukrainian insurgent army in the winter of 1946. And in the end, they were all killed or they had to give up.
Surely they knew they had no chance, that, the West was not going to come and rescue them. So why did they keep fighting anyways?
Right. Well, a lot of them are either on extreme nationalist grounds and hatred of basically what amounted to Russian rule, or general anti-communist grounds. But a lot of them had, as it were, burned their boats, that if they did surrender, they would, at the very best, have very long terms in the Gulag, the Soviet camp system, which killed most people, or be executed because they had fought against the return of the Red Army, and they fought alongside the Nazis to do that in the later stages of World War II. So, in a sense, they had nothing to lose. Well, leaping ahead here a little, but it's very important for us today. Stalin died in 1953, and Khrushchev will take full control from 1956. But he's amongst a group of leaders for those 3 years. And in 1954, he decided to transfer the Crimea, crucial in all the politicking going on around the war right now, from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, even though by then the largest group of people living there were Russians. Was this silly? Yes. But since it was all part of the USSR anyway, it didn't seem to matter. It would be like transferring a few towns from Ohio to Kentucky today, right? Or a couple of counties or something like that. It's all part of the same thing, so how far does it really, really matter? Not a lot. But what happens if the United States breaks up into its constituent states as independent countries? Which is, of course, precisely what happened to the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. So it didn't seem to matter at the time, but once the Soviet Union had broken up, it mattered a lot, particularly because of Crimea's strategic importance. The Soviet Navy, large parts of it had been based, the Black Sea Fleet had been based in the Crimean port. And so even once Ukraine had become independent, at the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia made sure that it had an agreement with newly independent Ukraine that it could still use those ports. Well, here's our map. We've leapt ahead now some decades. In 1991, the USSR fell apart, communism ended, and now the very different histories of East and West Ukraine leave tensions inside the country. Remember, as I made a point a few minutes ago, with all the communist countries, the past was never properly dealt with or openly discussed. There was no debate. Everything was buried under mountains of communist, I want to use a bad word here, but anyway, rubbish, right? And then when communism comes to an end, then that stuff hasn't really been dealt with. Well, take a look at this map. Now, you might remember years ago in one of your previous lives when you had to endure a college program at my hands, you had to look at Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, and he took Ukraine as a prime case in point, as what he called a cleft country. Well, here it is. Here are the election results from 2010, and Yulia Tymoshenko, the West-leaning candidate, wins the centre and all of the West, either by pretty large margins or overwhelming margins. And Yanukovych, the equally corrupt and Russian-leaning candidate, wins all of the East.
This is even more drastic than some of the divisions we see in the US.
Yes. I mean, the electoral map is starting to get a little messier in the US now, but certainly in the early part of this century, basically what you had in the US was blue West Coast and East Coast, and the north around the Great Lakes, and red south and middle, right? Just boom, there it was.
Right.
Well, yeah, this is even more drastic than that. And this correlates, as you can see on the right-hand side here, with the use of Russian as a native language. In fact, it's an almost exact correlation, where 20% or fewer of the population speak Russian as their native language, they're going to vote for West-leaning candidates. Where it's higher than 20%, they're going to vote for Russian-leaning candidates. And where it's more than the 50%, as it is in Crimea, as you can see, it's going to be overwhelming. Let's just take a look at West Ukraine. This is St. George's Greek Catholic or Uniate Cathedral in Lviv, built in the 18th century. We'll be hearing next week from a very able and articulate and smart spokesman for this church that plays such a large part in the public life of Western Ukraine. Now, in Ukraine, religion, even dormant or no longer active religion, that is, amongst secular people, does two things. It creates long-lasting affinity with cultural kindred. Now we're back to, I mentioned a moment ago, Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And as I'm sure I pointed out to you in class, just backing up what Huntington says, right? Let's take two completely secular people, one of them Belgian and one of them Bulgarian. And they think in completely different ways. But the secular Belgian has been shaped in his presuppositions and his manner of thinking by the long run effects of the Catholic Christianity that he no longer believes in, and the Bulgarian by the Orthodox Christianity that he no longer believes in. And the results are very different. Well, this is going on inside Ukraine, inside one country. So Uniates, Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics, and Protestants look west and feel themselves to be Westerners stranded in an only partly Western state. Whereas Orthodox, certainly Russian Orthodox, look east and see themselves as tied by history and culture to Russia. And again, this religion, even where it's dormant, even amongst people who think of themselves as secular, it creates habits of mind that condition those who experience them to take one side of a debate that to them has always been the only possible side, like the difference between our secular Belgian and our secular Bulgarian. Now, what about Ukraine's problems since independence? Well, they've been huge. It's had a terrible economy in what should be a prosperous country. Why should it be prosperous? Well, in particular, because it is a breadbasket. Its grain crop alone is immensely valuable in global terms. Right? Per capita GDP has been only about 27% of Russia's.
So in 2022, Russia was invading a country that wasn't just smaller in size, but actually a lot poorer.
Yes, a lot poorer. And the sad thing is, it didn't really need to be. Okay, it hadn't got Russia's oil, but it certainly had a load of other things in its favour. And it was run by a kleptocracy. Don't press me on the details, but we talked about the two candidates in 2010, and Yulia Tymoshenko and Yanukovych, in terms of their levels of corruption. There wasn't a lot to choose between them. And the country has long had chronic drug, alcohol, and AIDS problems. A whole load of social problems. I remember one of the things that saddened me most when I was visiting Lviv, and it was explained to me that there were plane loads of Turks flying into the city's airport, Turkish men, every day to visit the brothels in the city. So it's like there's a lot of degradation in the country. It's got this divided sense of identity between East and West. Now, that's changed in the last 10 years because loads of people in the East have decided they don't want to look to Russia anymore. Putin's been very good at creating his own enemies. But there's also the unresolved, suppressed discussion about the meaning of highly traumatic but very complicated experiences in World War II, which we looked at last week. Those haven't been properly addressed. Well, should we really have all these statues up to Stepan Bandera, for example? I mean, even Zelensky, well, he's Jewish. He's got every reason to say, I don't think we should have quite so many. Well, he's right, but try saying that to someone from Western Ukraine. Hard.
Oof.
But also Russia's determination not to allow Ukraine to drift into the Western camp, by which we mean membership of NATO and the EU. And then comes 2014, crucial year for Ukraine. Riots brought down its very corrupt and pro-Russian president. Now, Ukrainians continued to disagree about a lot, but they were now far more united than they'd ever been before about being independent of Russian meddling, about getting serious on beating down corruption, about becoming a full-on democracy, not just having, relatively free and fair elections. The mechanism, not just about having relatively free and fair elections, but having the mechanisms of society being transparent and open in the way that we might expect we should expect in the US and Europe, and mostly. and about joining the EU and NATO, which was, the issue of joining the EU was one of the things that triggered the Maidan revolt, the riots in 2014 that brought down Yanukovych. And in Russia, Putin responded to this by invading Crimea with his little green men and encouraging and arming ethnic Russian separatists in the east of the country to break away. And that fight's been going on ever since.
This was something that just kind of drifted out of the news headlines after a bit until 2022.
Right. It was in the news a lot at the time of the Russian takeover of Crimea and in the early phases of the separatist fighting. And then, of course, when the Dutch airliner was downed with all those hundreds of people killed, foreigners, mostly Dutch, Indonesians, Australians and others and so on. But outside of that, it didn't stay in the news until, as you say, 2022. And suddenly it got our attention again, and it's had it pretty much ever since. Now, why has the war started now? Well, in 2022, on a full scale. Because Ukraine's continued to go down the fully democratic path, and Russian meddling and subversion in Ukraine have actually been counterproductive. They persuaded the large majority that they don't want to be Russian. There are still some, sure, but whereas it was like 50%-ish, that's now down to 10 or 15%. And if anything, I suppose Russian crimes in the war have reduced that yet further. Ukraine's made it plain it wants to join the EU and NATO. Putin's described the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 as what he calls the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, he was no fan of the Bolsheviks or of Lenin. In fact, he can't stand them. Right? But he was a fan of the Soviet Union because it was an expression of Russian greatness and of it being a global power. And so he wants revenge for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The collapse of the Soviet Union isn't really Ukraine's fault, though.
No, it's not. But Ukraine has long been looked upon as the rather inferior little brother of Russia. That they are Russians, but they're like us, but they need to be, looked after and kept under control. That kind of attitude that's been there for a long time. But more than any of this, Putin is afraid for his own regime. He says the war is existential for Russia. It's not existential for Russia, but it is existential for his regime. Because if Russians see a successful, democratic, non-corrupt state in the twin Ukraine, well, they're going to overthrow him. So he has to destabilize Ukraine in order to keep power in Russia. So he's kind of locked into this now.
Right.
Well, what I think it'd be good to do at the end of this is to come back to where we started this whole series with contested Ukrainian history. Now just a quick prelude here. In Western Ukraine, the past won't go away and it leaves you feeling just sad when you're there. Lviv, classic case in point, had a horrendous 20th century. At the start of it, when it was in the Habsburg Empire, its population was about half Poles, more than half Poles, with large numbers of Ukrainians and Jews, but also significant minorities of Germans and Armenians. There are a whole lot of Armenian churches there. There's one that's still there, but it's not really functional, as well as others, Hutsuls, Hungarians. But modern political ideologies made it harder, much harder, for different kinds of people to live together. And World War II killed almost all the Jews. 1944 to 45 saw the driving out of the Germans, and it brought the driving out of the Poles too. And Lviv was incorporated into Soviet Ukraine, and Poland was shunted 100 miles westward. So now the city is almost a monochrome culture of Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. And most other towns of Western Ukraine saw the same transformation, or worse. Massacre, ethnic cleansing, driving out, forced assimilation. Look at this ethnic graph of Lviv in the 20th century. So the yellow line is Poles. In 1900, they're 50%. They got up to a little over 60% around World War II time, and then collapse to 10%, and now basically nothing. They're about 1%, actually. Jews, around 25, 28% in 1900, going up a bit by 1930, collapse and massacre during the war years. From 1950, they're maybe 8%, and now down to basically nothing as they've left to go to the US or Israel. The Russians have come in. You can see there were basically none in the early 20th century, but after World War II, they came in on the backs of the Soviets, so they've drifted out since Ukraine became independent, but they're still about 10% of the population. And Ukrainians, well, they were 20% of the population, and now they are 90%.
This has to be incredibly difficult for a city to go through this much drastic change in a relatively short period of time.
Yes. And if you're living there now and you've got any kind of public responsibility at all, you're going to be torn between denial or ignoring it and just getting on and managing life for now, because it's almost too painful to think about. Yes. And this city is not exceptional. This is true of a vast swathe of East Central Europe. It doesn't stop the city being extremely pretty, though. Look at this old town here with the Bernardine Church. Well, let's finish with a couple of slides that look at utterly contradictory versions of key historical processes and moments. So comparing a Ukrainian view, a Russian view, and where that's relevant, the Soviet view. So Kiev and Rus, back in the 10th century. Well, in the Ukrainian view, it's the beginnings of Ukraine. In the Russian view, it's the beginnings of Russia. What about the Russian conquest of Ukraine in the 18th century? Well, from a Ukrainian point of view, it's the coming of Russian domination. Russians insist it's liberation from the Tatars and the Ottomans. What about the emergence of Ukrainian nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Well, a national rebirth if you're Ukrainian. From a Russian view, it's unnecessary. Ukrainians and Belarusians are little Russians. The Soviets would have said, well, it's a bourgeois movement. Nationalists are bourgeois. What about the Bolshevik Revolution? If you're Ukrainian, you see it as a new form of Russian oppression. And the attempt, as we saw in an earlier episode, at creating Ukrainian states in the aftermath of World War I, those were all snuffed out, one after the other. The Russian view now is very ambivalent. Soviet view, of course, glorious. Well, let's move on. to more recent things. What about the Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine? Ukrainians insist it was a deliberate genocide of Ukrainians that killed millions and millions of people. In the Russian view, it was an accident. Non-Ukrainians suffered as well. It's just unlucky that Ukrainians maybe suffered more than most. The Soviet view, the whole thing was greatly exaggerated. What about World War II? In Ukrainian view, Nazis and Reds are fighting one another over Ukraine. Ukraine's a victim, with these monstrous forces fighting on their territory and over their heads, with, again, millions of Ukrainian dead. The Russians and the Soviets are alike viewed as the Great Patriotic War, which it sure doesn't look like if you live in Ukraine, certainly not in Western Ukraine. What about the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and their army? Well, Ukrainians see them as legitimate freedom fighters. In the Russian view and the Soviet view, they're Nazi collaborators. What about the post-1945 resistance that we referred to here a few minutes ago? Well, they're heroic if you're Ukrainian. They're fascist bandits in the Russian and the Soviet view. What about Khrushchev's giving Crimea to Ukraine in 1954? Well, Ukrainians view that as legitimate. It's now part of Ukraine. Russians say it was illegitimate. Khrushchev should never have done it. What about the Maidan protests in 2014? Well, if you're a Ukrainian, you see it as the overthrow of a corrupt pro-Russian puppet. And in the Russian view, it's a Western-backed coup. So the facts are not necessarily disputed, but the judgment of them is utterly different depending on where you're coming from. Everything is contested.
Yeah, and practically every major historical process or event is given a completely different meaning depending on who's interpreting it.
Yes, and that is no small part of what's being fought about in Ukraine right now, because your view of the past shapes how you view the present,
right,
and shapes your aspirations for the future.
And this is how Putin's able to, well, in his mind, justify his war with Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, he sees himself actually as a historian. Of course, in the summer of 2021, he writes this by now notorious history essay about Russia and Ukraine being one country and Ukraine not being a proper country and so on, and kind of laying the theoretical, historical groundwork for what he intends to do, which in February 2022 he does.
Yeah. And also the reason why I start to get sort of nervous when people in the US want to start pulling down statues or reframing the way that we're talking about history.
Right. Yes. Everything is at stake. The way that we think about the past shapes the way we think about the present and make our arrangements accordingly. Yes, exactly. And in a way, this is kind of paradigmatic for everything that we're trying to do here in this, not just in this particular series, but all of these series, to talk through these issues because they do affect now. And it really, really matters that we don't sell ourselves party lines, denominational lines, ideologically driven stuff. You can do it if all you want to do is make yourself feel better and convince yourself of how right you are. But you do that at the price of failing to see what's been going on.
Right.
So we know, people, that we are making some of you unhappy by the lines that we're taking in this series and some of the others, but we really, really are trying to give an Olympian judgment. And failing,
yes.
no doubt.
If only we could be Olympian ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the aspiration. That's the target. Well,
right.
We're not quite at the end of the series, because next week we're going to be coming back to look at the Greek Catholic Church and the huge role it plays in Western Ukrainian life, but also the particular angle that it has in what's going on in Ukraine right now. And that's going to conclude a series on this And 2 weeks from now, we're going to be starting off, some of you might be relieved to know, on a whole new series.
With a completely different set of information,
Right.
I suppose.
And was it Monty Python that used to say? And now for something completely different. But that's 2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
So until next week, thank you for staying with us, everybody, and we will see you then. Bye-bye now.